Salam and peace. This is Imam Malik Mujahid, and you're watching Muslim Network TV. Muslim Network TV is always there 24/7 through many means. Galaxy 19 satellite, which covers the whole United States of America, east to west, north to south, Canada, and Mexico. And we are available on OTT devices like Apple TV, Amazon Fire TV, Roku. You can download our app on your phone if you like, or if you are a big screen person, you can go through our website, muslimnetwork.tv, or used to watching everything on YouTube, you can go there, Muslim Network TV, our YouTube page. But once you are there, you owe it to us, so please subscribe. So a lot of people are watching, not many subscribing. That's the reason I'm asked to keep saying that. You know, there is a country who gets away no matter what they do to Palestinians, and that's Israel. President Carter, it was first one in 2006, he published a book entitled Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid. Although he did not directly say Israel is apartheid state, wow, it became a bestseller of New York Times list, but became a sort of a controversy. And President Carter, Anti-Defamation League, ADL, accused President Carter of engaging in anti-Semitism. But they were also saying we didn't call him anti-Semite. I don't know what's the difference there. 4 years later, a professor, Professor Richard Falk, who at that time was the United Nations Special Rapporteur, gave report to the United Nations, reporting it to be apartheid state. Of course, he was also accused of being anti-Semite. Now this month, 10 years later, almost, a leading Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem, it has declared Israel and occupied lands as a single apartheid regime. Single apartheid regime. They do not recognize Gaza Strip and the settlements and the West Bank and Israel separate entity. They call it a single apartheid regime. The report asserts that the Palestinians have fewer rights than Jews in the entire area between Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River. The report says it is not a democracy. Israel is not a democracy, but an apartheid state where roughly 7 million Jews and 7 million Palestinians live under a single system with vastly unequal rights. The International Criminal Code defines apartheid as an, quote, institutionalized regime of systemic oppression and domination by one racial group, unquote. Let me repeat that. Institutionalized regime of systemic oppression and domination by one racial group, unquote. So it has been a while. President Carter spoke, then Professor Richard Falk spoke, and finally the largest human rights organization of Israel, led by Jews, B'Tselem, is saying the same thing. Earlier, two people were accused of anti-Semitism. I wonder if B'Tselem will be called something similar to it. Today, we have one of the person who in 2011 reported to the United Nations as a special rapporteur, Professor Richard Falk, with us. Welcome to Muslim Network TV, Professor.
Very happy to be with you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Professor Richard Falk is Professor Emeritus of the International Law in Practice at Princeton University. He served a 6-year term as a United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories. So, Professor, do you feel vindicated that now a Jewish-led organization's human rights organization, largest one, is calling Israel an apartheid state?
Well, I guess I don't feel so much personally vindicated because it seemed so convincing to me, both when I was Special Rapporteur at the UN, and then later I did a collaborative academic study with Virginia Tilley that looked very carefully at the practice and policies of Israel toward the Palestinians, and it seemed so overwhelmingly convincing that it was just a matter of ideological resistance that failed to acknowledge that this was an example, and a rather acute example, of apartheid. My predecessor as Special Rapporteur, John Dugard, who's a distinguished South African jurist, has recently been quoted as saying that the Israeli version of apartheid is infinitely worse, those were his words, infinitely worse than what existed in South Africa. And what existed in South Africa was pretty bad. Terrible, in fact. I was there as a special observer of a leading political trial of resistors to apartheid. And I had the opportunity then to see what the apartheid system was like. And I can second the view of John Dugard by also affirming that in many respects, not in every respect, the Israeli way of victimizing the Palestinian people is a severe example of an apartheid regime.
That's interesting. You said that you have been to South Africa in legal matters and you have been a special rapporteur to occupied territories of Palestine, and you feel that based on your observation and studies, it is a worse form of apartheid. In what ways you think it is worse than South Africa? Because South Africa apartheid, everyone seems to know, understand, agree, and that is reversed. But people don't seem to understand that. But what you're saying is you're going, extra yard by saying it is worse. In what shape it is worse?
Well, it's a complicated issue, of course. It's partly worse because it's lasted so long, and it's partly worse because those that had lived in this country of South Africa remained a majority of the population, and therefore the forms of repression were ugly, but not nearly as violent as what Israel has resorted to in dealing with resistance on the part of the Palestinian people. Also, the historical circumstances are very significant. South Africa established an apartheid system in a settler colonial society at a time when colonialism was still an acceptable form of political organization of a sovereign state. By the time that Israel was established in 1948, colonialism was on the way out. And in fact, the establishment of Israel is the only example of swimming against the historical tide by which European colonialism was collapsing all over the world while Israel was being established. And it is in some ways a tribute to the commitment of the Zionist movement and of the historical circumstances of the Holocaust that allowed this to happen. European and North American governments were very guilty about not doing more to stop Hitler at an earlier stage. And they made the Palestinian people pay the price of their own moral neglect. And this is one of the tragedies of the whole situation. And of course, the whole idea of a Jewish homeland came from the British Foreign Office in 1917 in the form of the Balfour Declaration over a century ago. And that was a pure colonial act that the British should decide that in a country that was not part of their, at that time, was not part at all of their domain, that they agreed to the idea that a Jewish homeland should be established in Palestine, which at that time was still part of the Ottoman Empire. It was during World War I. So the history is complex, but it leads almost from its outset to the idea that Jewish supremacy was the core of the Zionist undertaking. And to establish a Jewish supremacy in a non-Jewish society at a time when colonialism was on its way out and nationalism was robust, necessitated a repressive regime. There was no way other than by apartheid from the very beginning. It took a different form than in South Africa, but the essence of one ethnicity suppressing another and victimizing the other was similar. And one thing that the B'Tselem report doesn't do, which our report to the UN did do, was to say that the form of apartheid was directed not only at territory, but at people. And therefore, the refugees are part of the victimization pattern that Israeli apartheid assumed, and should be understood that apartheid in the Israeli context refers not only to territory, but to people. And the forcible dispersion and fragmentation of the Palestinian people is part of how Israel established Jewish supremacy. And because it wanted to be a democracy, which South Africa never pretended to be, it also had to engage in ethnic cleansing and force a large part of the Palestinian population to become refugees in neighboring countries in the Arab world. And this catastrophe, which in Arabic, as you know, has the name Nakba, is part of the originality of the apartheid experience that the Palestinians have endured for so long.
What reaction did your report get in 2011 when you reported to the United Nations that it is an apartheid state?
Well, at that time, the report was attacked by very pro-Israeli NGOs, particularly UN Watch in Geneva, and it accused me of anti-Semitism and of defaming the Jewish state. That report did get significant attention from other right-wing sources, and I was quite frequently criticized. But at that time, the defense of Israel in substantive terms was directed not at the allegations of violations of human rights, but at the person that made those allegations. You try to wound or, if possible, kill the messenger so that you don't have to deal with the message. But later on, in 2017, when our report was issued from the Economic Social Commission for West Asia, that report was denounced in the Security Council by the American ambassador at the time, Nikki Haley, and I was personally attacked at that time too, and also by the Israeli ambassador to the UN. And it got much more attention and really put the apartheid discourse onto the political map. It did something that my earlier report and Carter's, the controversy over Carter's title, incidentally, that title was a question. He made the question, apartheid or peace. He sort of posed that Israel's future was either to make peace or to become an apartheid state. He didn't make the allegation, as I would have done, that it was already an apartheid state, and that the only way it could become a source of a peaceful relationship between the two peoples was to dismantle apartheid, as South Africa had to do when it decided that it wanted to make some kind of racial peace with the African people within its borders.
You're watching Muslim Network TV. This is Imam Malik Mujahid, and we're talking with Professor Richard Falk. We'll be right back after these messages.
My wife, she's a professor at the University of Cincinnati, who's Catholic, and by her watching and listening to our 3-year-old son watch Adam's World, she ended up taking Kalima Shahada. She embraced Islam because she learned so much about Islam and the other prophets. It really affected our life in a great way, and because of Sound Vision and Adam's World, we're Muslims.
I took my Shahada 15 years ago, and I actually am from a rural part of Ohio. And so I found the catalog for Sound Vision, and I ordered the tapes and the CDs and the books, and I used those, and especially for my little daughter, that's how we basically learned our Islam, and Islam entered our hearts through the wonderful works of Sound Vision.
Okay, assalamu alaikum, brother. I just want you to know that I love the Sound Vision website, that a lot of times when I'm looking for information, especially as it relates to homelessness, domestic violence, and women issues, I go to that website, and then I see what you've written, and then I copy and paste it and spread the word, because the wisdom is there, so I can't do any better than what Sound Vision has already done.
Sound Vision is our survival guide. It is the organization that provides skills for Muslims how to survive and thrive in this community here in the US.
Assalamu alaikum, my name is Anam, I'm in 11th grade, and I grew up with Adam's World, and what it taught me was unity, respect, and love for the Muslim Ummah.
Adam's World is the greatest show ever made. Take me to the Kaaba, man. I love that puppet.
Welcome back to Muslim Network TV. This is Imam Malik Mujahid. We're talking with Professor Richard Falk, who was a professor of international law at Princeton, but also the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine, who used the term, it seems, for the first time, that Israel is an apartheid state, reporting to the United Nations. As compared to 2011, now it's 2021 when B'Tselem has issued the same statement as you did. Why it took B'Tselem, which is a human rights organization based in Israel, focused on it that long to use that term?
Well, because it is such an inflammatory term and does invoke the memory of South Africa and the BDS campaign that was carried out by the international community with UN backing, that eventually generated the pressure that brought the system of apartheid to a crash landing in South Africa. So it was quite evident that to make this allegation was a very serious political challenge to the established order. And it took and still takes a great deal of courage on the part of the B'Tselem organization to do this. And they've been defamed by one of the, I think the Minister of Education, maybe, or one of the cabinet ministers in the Israeli government, and by some other political figures have already challenged B'Tselem. But you know, the truth of the matter is that in the internal Israeli dialogue for many, many years, going back to David Ben-Gurion, the first political leader of Israel, there were warnings that if Israel doesn't make peace with the Palestinians, it would it would deteriorate and become an apartheid state. That and many leaders, and as recently as Olmert, have echoed that, but always in Hebrew and always within the framework of Israel itself. So it's only defamatory as far as Israel is concerned if the assertion is in English and in a international venue. And so it's not, the pretension that this is so shocking is part of the Israeli narrative. And the B'Tselem report is so significant partly because it has been published in English, and also it comes, as you suggest, Malik, from a respected human rights Israeli organization that is self-consciously Zionist in its own outlook, and it puts liberal Zionists in America and elsewhere in a rather awkward situation, because the implication of saying it's apartheid convincingly is to say that the whole political undertaking is at this moment a criminal enterprise, and that other governments and the UN and the peoples of the world have an opportunity and a responsibility to do something about this situation. And the BDS campaign, which has been criminalized and attacked in all sorts of ways in many of the states within America and in Europe, suddenly becomes a legitimate instrument of nonviolent pressure to achieve lawful goals. And
So, Israel, let's understand a little bit more detail of this charge of this is apartheid state. And I will take one step by other. Say, how Israel differentiates in its citizenship Jews versus Palestinian.
Well, there are several ways it becomes quite complicated. For one thing, it passed a so-called basic law, which has a kind of constitutional status in 2018, which asserted the supremacy of the Jewish people and declared Israel to be the state of the Jewish people and Hebrew to be the only acceptable language. And in a sense, openly differentiated Jews from non-Jews within the state of Israel itself, let alone the occupied territories. And in addition to this, there have been a whole bunch of discriminatory laws. The most well-known concerns the right of return. Jews anywhere, anywhere in the world, even without any real association with Palestine by family or relatives living there or having been born there, any Jew anywhere in the world has a right of return and is entitled to legal immigration. Whereas non-Jews and Palestinians in particular, even if they have parents that were born in Palestine and grandparents that were born in Palestine, have no right of return. So that's a fundamental discrimination.
So how Jewish settlers are treated as opposed to Palestinian residents in terms of apartheid, calling it apartheid?
Well, it's the brunt of the real purpose is to prevent Palestinian immigration. And it also is much more strict with non-Palestinians. And the whole idea is that unlike, as I said earlier, unlike South Africa, Israel's legitimacy rests on the claim of being democratic. And that means that it has to maintain a clear Jewish majority, because the Palestinians as a minority do not accept the legitimacy of this Jewish supremacy that's at the basis of the Zionist project. And but that's not the only thing. For instance, if there are Palestinian citizens of Israel that want to have some kind of family unification, or even get married to a Palestinian from the West Bank, they are very rarely granted permission. Also, land ownership and building permits in East Jerusalem and in Israel itself are much more restricted with respect to Palestinians than to Jews. Now, it is true that there are Druze and Christian minorities also in Israel, and they too are to a degree victimized by this form of discrimination. But in their cases, it is more it is a form of discrimination that is a violation of international law, but the regime itself, the Israeli regime, is focused on the Palestinian minority in Israel and the Palestinian resistance and population overall. So I think it is fair to regard these laws that are directed at Palestinians as integral to the apartheid overall scheme. And particularly if you take into account the displacement and dispossession of as many as 700,000 Palestinians at the time when Israel was established, and the disallowance of those people to return, even the people that were expelled under wartime or fled under wartime conditions, have never been allowed to return. And that too is a distinct violation of international law, but also is part of this idea that the territory of the sovereign state of Israel that was delimited by the 1948 Armistice Agreement is one which practices a form of apartheid despite having a gentler treatment of the Palestinian and non-Palestinian residents than does their treatment in other parts of the overall regime. And part of the B'Tselem report is to make the case for saying Israel is not just the state that is on the map. It's also administers and has for more than 50 years the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza as if they were part of one country. And throughout that one country, there is different forms, but the unifying element is this acute form of discrimination and victimization in order to maintain Jewish supremacy. And one sees that with the settlement phenomenon in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, the form of blockade that is directed at Gaza, and the unwillingness to allow Palestinian refugees any right of return.
So share with us, I'm particularly disturbed by the images of Israeli soldiers arresting little kids who are peeing in their pants, little kids. Why these children are arrested? I know it may not directly have any implication for the consideration of apartheid, but does Israeli arrest Jewish children like that also?
No, of course not. No, the whole treatment of Jewish offenders of the criminal law is in accord with the practice of Western countries and maintains international standards. I think I've thought about this quite a long time myself, and I think it has to do with what I would call a politics of state terror. That because Israel is going against this historical anti-colonial trend, and they know that they are hated by a large portion of the population, that means that they want to do everything to humiliate and convey the message to the Palestinians, including the very young ones, that if they resist, they will suffer acutely. So it's not just the person that is the target of this violence. It is to intimidate and to discourage and to demoralize Palestinian resistance. And one of the remarkable positive things is that despite this effort to destroy Palestinian resistance, it has sustained itself over a century of abuse. and that abuse started in the Mandate period when Britain was administering Palestine, and then continued from 1948 till the present. And there's no sign that it will vanish in the near future, but neither will Palestinian resistance vanish. And it enjoys global solidarity, support of, I think, a growing majority that includes many younger Jews.
You're watching Muslim Network TV. This is Imam Malik Mujahid. I'm talking with Professor Falk, and we'll be right back after these messages.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Adam. You remember me? I appeared in so many episodes that Sound Vision has put on the market. No matter what. Hey, what's happening? Hey, oh, sorry. Lockdown is what it is. Well, continuing here. In this lockdown, Sound Vision never stops thinking about you, the viewer. We'll have to get back into production again, online and inline. Everybody in their own space, even me. Although I'm stuck with Lanisa.
Salam! Salam! Salam!
I know, you were shocked too. Well, let me continue. This is what I was going to say. Salam! 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 Cut! Finally, I get my own screen time again. Thank God. And so we invested in new equipment to bring you even better production with new songs and new singers and animations. Well, here are a few clips. And Sound Vision has brought all this into your home, making Islamic values and teachings easy. And if you know me, Adam, a multi-talented actor, well, sometimes I'm an actor and the reporter and the... Oh, that's enough. Let's move on to the next section. Well, you can watch these new episodes on our new app at www.adamsworldapp.com. We have previews happening every day on Muslim Network TV. Sound Vision has been serving generations, moving and changing with the times. We are all faithfully connected. That is a huge blessing. Your donation helps keep these programs available now and into the future. We take this job of helping tomorrow's Muslims today seriously, and you should too. Today, we need your help. Children absorb and learn from everything they encounter. Make that wholesome, positive, grounded in our faith. Together, we can accomplish our goal of raising better Muslims, better neighbors, and better citizens. Please donate generously. It's an investment in our future. But to finish, let me tell you, there are new scripts of my new mission. And it is something that I enjoy talking about. My new mission is space. Houston, we do not have a problem. Salam, see you soon. Me too.
Welcome back to Muslim Network TV. This is Imam Malik Mujahid. I'm talking with Professor Richard Falk, who was not only Professor of International Law at Princeton, but also UN Rapporteur on Palestine. What if you think, Professor, is that demolishing Palestinian houses, which law is being used for this purpose? And if there is some violation on the part of Palestinian, is the same violation will get houses demolished in Tel Aviv?
No. The answer is that everything that Israel does under the military administration of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, where these demolitions have been taking place, and in increasing numbers, incidentally, has to do, that is justified by Israel as necessary for security, either to deter what is called terrorism, or to make territorial expansions of settlements and of other uses of Palestinian territory. Sometimes it's a punishment for not upholding the Israeli requirements to obtain certain kinds of building permits, and Palestinians are routinely denied these permits and yet have large families, and so they often do engage in construction that isn't authorized, and that's kind of used as an administrative excuse. Then if there is a incident or
pardon me for interruption, but if an unauthorized house is built or extension is built by the Jewish citizen of the Israel, will their house will be demolished with bulldozer as well?
No, of course not. Demolition is only used as a punitive measure in relation to the Palestinians. Now, it may have been used occasionally. I'm not aware of any instance against Christians or Druze if they were seen to, in some way, threaten Israeli security. It may be that in Israel itself, where there's a construction project that is given a kind of public order status, Jewish homes will be demolished, but their owners will get full compensation, and it will be a case of what is called in American legal discourse eminent domain. In other words, the state has the authority to demolish houses and expropriate property if it pays adequate compensation for legitimate public projects. But this is done punitively against the Palestinians, including collective punishment. In other words, if the son of a family commits or is accused of committing some kind of terrorist act, the house of the family, which had nothing to do with the act, will be demolished, allegedly to deter others from engaging in this kind of behavior. So it's collective punishment, which itself is considered a violation of international humanitarian law.
Do they have equal access to water and food and supplies?
You mean in Israel itself or in the occupied area?
Do Palestinian, in everything which controlled by Israel, do Palestinian have equal right to water?
Well, in Israel itself, their standard of living is significantly lower, but they have equal rights to water, food, and everything but land and access to certain security positions in the government. But in the occupied territories, there is severe discrimination with regard to access to water and the appropriation of water by the settlements on the one side, which are given very privileged access, and to the Palestinian residents that are given very meager access. And there are all sorts of infractions of that sort that really reinforce this kind of double standard that's applied in the occupied territories, Israeli standards for the Jewish settlers and oppressive standards for the Palestinians.
When you served as a UN Special Rapporteur on human rights in the Palestinian occupied territories, how often did you visit the area?
Well, I tried to visit the area first shortly after I was appointed, and I was expelled. And it was a very strange experience because they put me in a prison near the Ben Gurion airport in Tel Aviv when I arrived, after having approved of our itinerary, which we submitted to the Israeli embassy in Switzerland, and which signaled their willingness to allow me to come, as they had allowed my predecessors in this position to come. But once I got there, they expelled me and then lied to the media. They said that they had warned me not to come, which was untrue, and had objected to my appointment at the time it was publicly announced, which was true. They did object to my appointment, and they had objected to the underlying mandate of the UN to overlook or to investigate human rights violations in the occupied territories.
So were you ever allowed to enter after that?
I could only go to Gaza by way of Egypt, which I did. And Gaza, of course, is in some ways the most victimized part of this what one could call an archipelago of apartheid conditions which vary from domain to domain. And it was even difficult to go from Egypt because the security situation was very bad to get from Cairo to Gaza. And then, of course, in Gaza itself, it was rather precarious to be there, but I was able to go there. And I did the rest of my work as special rapporteur by frequent visits to Egypt, Lebanon, and Jordan. And people, to the extent they could come out or were in exile, I was able to have a good deal of contact. A lot of the human rights violations, it helps to go and see for yourself what the situation is, but the information is publicly available. And so the Israelis don't really make much of a secret of how they govern and their rationalizations for what they do. I had been, before being special rapporteur, I had visited Israel and the occupied territories on several occasions. So I was familiar with the basic situation.
Charter of Human Rights came out of the whole tragedy of Holocaust, and came International Criminal Court and International Court of Justice. You being professor of international law, how do you reflect? Were all those institutions helpful to stand for human rights? Are the international human rights regime is strengthening or weakening?
That's a very good question, and probably you would get different responses from different international law experts. On balance, I think they have been helpful, but not to the Palestinians up to this point. And the reason they're helpful where geopolitics doesn't play a crucial role. And that's true throughout international political life. You have to recognize that even in the UN, sovereign states are only formally equal, and members are only formally equal. And this is recognized constitutionally in the UN by giving the 5 winners in World War II the right of veto. So in effect, the UN is saying to the most dangerous countries in the world, you don't have to obey international law if you think it's against your national interests or your strategic goals. And that's always been a limitation on what the UN can do. At the same time, even in relation to Palestine, it can establish the conditions under which law should be applied. And that's very helpful to civil society and to the international public opinion and to many of the non-Western governments. For instance, you have a situation of a big gap between the illegitimacy of these policies as they're viewed from the perspective of international law and as they would be viewed if they could be brought before the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice. In 2004, the General Assembly of the UN did ask the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, whether establishing a separation wall between Israel and Palestine and the occupied Palestinian territories was consistent with international law, and the court, by an 11-4 vote, decided that it was illegal, unlawful. The wall should be dismantled, particularly those parts that were built on occupied Palestinian territory, and damages should be paid to the Palestinian people. This, as you can probably guess, was never done. Israel defied the International Court of Justice and, in fact, challenged its legitimacy to consider something of this sort. With the International Criminal Court also, the court has been attacked by the Trump presidency and by the leadership in Israel because it initiated an investigation of whether the Palestinians were being victimized by violations of international humanitarian law. And so what one sees is a symbolic relevance of these institutions, but an inability to translate that symbolism into changes on the ground with respect to behavior. So it's very hard to understand for ordinary people, I think, because on the one hand, international law and the UN and these judicial institutions look very weak. On the other hand, they establish the conditions of legitimacy, which, if you look at the changes in international life since the end of World War II, it's not the big armies and military superiority that prevail, but those forces that control the moral and legal high ground that usually eventually prevail. And that's really the hope of the Palestinian people in the end. And this is a lesson that the US never learned. It had total military superiority in Vietnam and yet lost the war. And it's gone on to really lose the purpose of its subsequent undertakings of a similar sort in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Iraq. And so
let me ask you a little different question, Professor. You're very helpful in this conversation. Do you think the Oslo Accord contributed somehow to strengthening the apartheid state development?
I didn't think so at first. I thought that it made a kind of opening for some sort of political compromise in the form of a two-state solution. I didn't think that was ideal. And my friend Edward Said, who was a great spokesperson for the Palestinian struggle, was very skeptical from the moment he saw the accord that underlay the Oslo diplomacy. I came to agree with him. This was something that was used by Israel essentially as a way of consolidating their presence in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, where they greatly expanded the settlements and managed to get rid of a lot of Palestinians, especially in Jerusalem. And the Palestinians got nothing in exchange. So I think it was a bad diplomatic move. And in the Oslo Accords, which was a deficiency from the outset, the basic rights of the Palestinians were never acknowledged, such as the right of self-determination. And so it was an unfair framework.
Let me ask you a final question. We have just half a minute left. Do you think Palestinians will have equal rights as Israelis in your lifetime?
Well, that's a very big crystal ball question that I would probably be foolish to answer. I'm enough of an optimist to feel that the struggle to achieve that in my lifetime is valuable, and that history is uncertain enough to make that hopeful possibility become real. And the South African story does seem to give greater weight to that hope, because it also seemed impossible until it happened.
Well, impossible until it happened. I think some great people have said that. Well, thank you so much, Professor Richard Falk, for being with us. Professor has been a special rapporteur for 6 years for the United Nations on the human rights on the occupied Palestine, and a professor of international law, formerly at the Princeton University. And thank you, Sherdil Khan and Dr. Abdul Wahid, for producing today's show. And thank you for watching. Muslim Network TV brings you amazing conversation. We are 24/7 on our Galaxy 19 satellite. You can watch through that, or Apple TV, Amazon Fire TV, Roku, or download our app, Muslim Network TV, or watch it on YouTube. But when you do subscribe. Peace. Salam.
Thank you so much, madam.
Thank you.